Everyone dreams of their wedding day. Some people want something extravagant, full of imported flowers and musicians playing the violin as they enter the hall. Others prefer something more intimate, just friends and family, with no frills. Me? I just wanted a peaceful wedding, on my own land, surrounded by the people I love. But it seems that the HOA, or rather, the damn HOA president, had other plans. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that certain people don't know the meaning of the word limit. You give them a little bit of power, and suddenly they think they can rule the universe. This woman was exactly like that. Ever since she became president of the HOA, she believed that the condominium was a kingdom, and she was the absolute queen. But she didn't expect anything. I wasn't just another resident. I'm the county sheriff. And it was exactly this information that she forgot to check before trying to send fake police officers to arrest me in the middle of my wedding. The problem started months before, when we announced that the wedding would take place on my property. And no, it wasn't just any plot of land in a condominium. My family had owned that land for generations, long before the HOA existed. But apparently, that didn't stop this woman from trying to stick her nose in where it didn't belong. I received the first notification 2 weeks after the invitations were sent out. One of those pompous emails, full of boring words like violation of regulation and community impact. In short, she wanted me to ask permission to get married on my own property. Of course I ignored it. If there's one thing I won't do, it's ask permission to live my life from a woman who thinks that putting a vase on the balcony without formal approval is a crime worthy of punishment. But of course, she wouldn't take no for an answer. If I thought the HOA was just going to forget about this story, I was sorely mistaken. A few days later, the suspicious inspections began. HOA cars were parked outside my property, as if they were on patrol. One day, I came out of my house and found a drone flying above my property. Yes, a drone. It was spying on my wedding. Every new day, a new problem was invented by her. A supposed noise complaint when the party hadn't even started yet. A report that there was illegal construction on my property, the same structures that had been there for decades. And the pinnacle? A summons claiming that guests needed special permission to enter the condominium. I mean, she wanted to bar my friends and family at the gate, as if my land was hers. When the wedding day arrived, I knew she wasn't going to give up. I just didn't think she'd go so far as to send fake policemen to break it up. The ceremony was already underway. The music was playing. The guests were laughing and chatting, and I was finally starting to believe that everything was going to be all right. Sweet illusion. That's when 3 armed men, dressed as policemen, entered the event. One of them pulled out a piece of paper and announced loudly for everyone to hear, "You are being arrested for violating HOA rules." Yes, my friends, the HOA has issued a warrant for my arrest. It was at that moment that the whole party froze. The bride stopped in the middle of her walk down the aisle. The guests were stunned. Someone dropped a glass of champagne. And what about me? Oh, I could only laugh, because I knew something they didn't. Something that would make that day go down in HOA history as the worst mistake that woman had ever made in her life. It's not every day that someone tries to send fake cops to arrest you in the middle of your own wedding. But there I was, standing at the altar, looking at 3 guys who clearly thought they were about to star in the HOA's greatest victory. The silence was absolute. The groom, me, stood still. The bride stunned. The guests frozen with their champagne glasses in the air. And then, as if it were a scene from a badly scripted movie, one of the fake policemen pulled out a document and announced, "You are being arrested for violating HOA rules." And that's when I realized they had no idea who I was. She didn't tell them. She, in her arrogance and obsession with control, thought she could set up this scene of public humiliation without checking one essential detail. The man she wanted to arrest was none other than the county sheriff. But calm down. I didn't react immediately. First, I wanted to enjoy the moment. Then, I did what any sane person would do in the face of such a circus. I laughed. "Are you laughing?" asked one of the guys, visibly confused. My friend, I said, crossing my arms. Do you know who I am? The three of them exchanged glances. The answer was obvious. No, they didn't know. It was then that my fiancée, finally recovered from the shock, burst out, "Is this a joke?" And that's when the chaos began. The audience began to stir. Some of the guests pulled out their cell phones and started recording. Others were already cursing the fake policeman, while the ceremony itself dissolved into murmurs of revolt. He can't be arrested at his own wedding. This is illegal. Does the HOA think it has that much power? And then, as a nice wedding present, my great-aunt, an 84-year-old lady with absolutely no patience for nonsense, shouted, "My nephew is the sheriff! You idiots!" The reaction was better than I expected. The fake policeman paled. One of them even tried to hold his ground, but it was too late. Shock crossed their faces as if they had just realized that they had entered the wrong zoo cage. And to make matters worse, well, my real officers were among the guests. Yes, my co-workers, the ones who really have authority, were there watching the antics. And all it took was one look from me for them to understand what was going on. Sergeant Miller, a police veteran who has seen me deal with much more dangerous things than a trio of extras from a bad movie, stepped forward and calmly asked, "Is this a prank?" It was enough to make one of the fake cops swallow. They were screwed. Before one of them had a chance to answer, the real cops pulled out their credentials and guns. In a matter of seconds, the fakes were searched and disarmed. And then, out of nowhere, who appears in the middle of the melee? Her. The woman, the one who set it all up, came out of the shadows with her eternal clipboard in hand and her nose held high, as if she was still convinced that somehow she would manage to turn things around. "The HOA has authority over this property," she said, as if that were enough to invalidate the United States Constitution. Sergeant Miller looked at her as if he had just seen a penguin in a suit trying to lecture her on the law. "Ma'am, do you have any idea what you've just done?" She crossed her arms and snorted. "We're just applying the rules." Oh yes, applying the rules? By having 3 fake policemen arrest the county sheriff in the middle of his own wedding. If that was applying the rules, I was beginning to believe that this woman had come out of a laboratory where they studied how to create the worst kind of neighbors. So I decided it was my turn to talk. "You sent fake policemen to arrest me at my own wedding," I said, staring at her. "Do you realize how many crimes you've just committed?" And it was at that very moment that she realized it. Confidence was gone. Her eyebrows arched. Her face went pale. She finally understood that she had crossed a line. But, of course, she still tried to argue. I was just following the HOA guidelines." Sergeant Miller didn't let her finish. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent." And then, with the class of someone who has seen all the idiocy in the world, he handcuffed the woman right there. The audience erupted in applause. My fiancée looked at me and, without losing her tone, whispered, "That was the best wedding present I could have gotten." Well, I was still digesting everything, but I knew one thing. This story didn't end there. Because if she thought that being arrested in front of the whole community was bad, wait until you find out what happens when you try to bring down someone who has real power in the city. If I could freeze one moment in my memory forever, it would be the exact second she realized she was screwed. The handcuffs glinted in the sunlight as Sergeant Miller tightened them around her wrists. The look of shock, the mouth opening and closing without a sound, the eyes rolling from side to side, as if looking for a hole to stick her head in. She couldn't accept reality. The president of the HOA, who thought she ran the whole town, was being caught in the middle of the wedding she tried to ruin. But the best was yet to come. The 3 fake cops were already leaning against the car, searched, and with faces that were a mixture of confusion and pure regret. None of them had expected this farce to end in real arrests. My fiancée, still in her dress, with a bouquet in her hand and an expression of pure fury, approached the woman. "You've ruined our wedding," she said, without shouting, but with that tone that sends shivers down anyone's spine. The woman, instead of staying quiet and accepting that she had destroyed her own life, tried to argue. The HOA has authority over this property. Sergeant Miller snorted. The laugh that escaped him was not one of amusement, but of pure debauchery. "Ma'am, can you repeat that? Just so I'm sure I heard correctly." She continued, "This land is part of the community and is under the rules of the HOA. That was the exact moment Miller looked at me, crossed his arms, and asked, "Do you want to tell her, or do I do the honors?" Ah, I've waited so long for this. I crossed my arms, lifted my chin, and spoke very slowly, so that she could feel every word. "I own this county. If she had been pale before, now she looked as if someone had syringed the blood from her face." The silence was absolute. The guests all held their breath. The fake policeman froze. "What?" she barely managed to say. "You heard right." I smiled, feeling the delicious taste of revenge. "The HOA has no authority over my land, because my land is technically sovereign. Yes, that's right. My family owns a large part of the county. The piece of land where the HOA was built only existed because my great-grandfather sold lots to the first residents. But the land where I got married, that never left our family. And do you know what that means? The HOA never had any power over me. Never. And that's why, at that moment, she realized that her life was officially over. The fall of the HOA empire. Now that she knew she had made one of the biggest mistakes of her life, panic began to take over. "This can't be right," she muttered. I need to talk to a lawyer." Sergeant Miller laughed. "That's a good idea. Because, in addition to trespassing, fraud, and coercion, you're also involved in hiring fake officers, which could be considered kidnapping if it were brought to court." The murmuring among the guests turned into an avalanche of whispers. She not only destroyed her own name, but possibly threw the entire HOA into the abyss along with her. And then came the icing on the cake. My great-aunt, always ready for a final blow, raised her cell phone and showed it to the crowd. I recorded everything, every word, and it wasn't just her. Several guests were filming the very moment the woman confessed that she believed the HOA was above the law. There was no way out for her. The end of the dictator queen. As she was being put into the police car, my fiancé held my hand and, with a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes, said, "I love you." But this was by far the most insane wedding in the world. I laughed. Yes, maybe it was. But you know what? It was worth every second. The woman disappeared into the car, and the 3 fake policemen were taken away soon after. The HOA would never be the same after that day. And the best part? Justice had only just begun. Because if she thought her public humiliation would be the worst punishment, wait until you see what I did next. If the wedding itself had been unforgettable, the days that followed were even better. After she was taken away by the police, the whole condominium turned into an anthill of gossip, celebration, and, of course, revolt against the HOA. It was as if everyone had suddenly woken up from their trance and realized the level of insanity this woman had imposed on people for years. But for me, that still wasn't enough. Yes, seeing her handcuffed in the middle of my wedding was an Oscar-worthy spectacle, but I wanted something more, lasting, something that would guarantee that she would never have power over anyone again. And that's how the trial of the HOA queen began. The next day, all hell broke loose within the HOA board. The other board members tried desperately to pretend they knew nothing about the attempt to arrest me with fake police officers. But guess what? I had evidence against them too. Because, you see, when you're a county sheriff and you know there's an abusive HOA acting like a local dictatorship, you start gathering evidence long before you need to use it. I had emails, messages, even recordings of internal meetings where they admitted they were trying to force me to follow rules that didn't even apply to my land. So when I took this paperwork straight to the local court, the HOA started to crumble like a house of cards. The board, which until then had thought it could get away with it, began to panic. 3 members resigned immediately. The rest tried a different approach. "Let's sort it out internally," said one of them, almost pleading. "Ah, but I wasn't interested in sorting it out internally. I wanted a spectacle. I wanted everyone to see that this kind of abuse of power could no longer exist." A few weeks later, the day of the trial finally arrived. The courtroom was full. Residents of the condominium were there to watch the show. Journalists showed up because, let's face it, this story was too good to ignore. And there she was, the former president of the HOA, sitting at the defense table with a posture that tried to convey confidence, but with eyes that showed the desperation of someone who knew she was screwed. The prosecutor began calmly. The defendant, as president of the HOA, used her position to coerce, harass, and attempt to illegally arrest a citizen during her own wedding. That was the first blow. The second came soon after. In addition, we have evidence that the defendant used HOA funds to finance illegal operations, including the payment of fake police officers. Yes, she paid the fake cops with HOA money. This meant that, in addition to all the other crimes, she was also being charged with fraud and embezzlement. And, as icing on the cake, her lawyer tried to argue, "My client was just trying to maintain order in the community." The judge didn't even bother to hold in her laughter. "Order? You mean to tell me that sending fake policemen to kidnap a man on his wedding day is keeping order?" That's when I realized that the battle had already been won. She was completely alone. Not even the remaining members of the HOA were there to defend her. On the contrary, they were busy trying to protect themselves, saying that they didn't know anything and that they never authorized anything of the sort. If before she thought she had allies, at that moment it became quite clear that no one was going to burn themselves to protect her. And then came the verdict. The court found the defendant guilty of all charges. I wanted to clap, but I stopped myself. The sentence? 10 years in prison, payment of compensation, and a lifetime ban from performing in any HOA. In other words, the woman who lived to control the lives of others would never be able to do that again in her life. Her reaction? Scream. She got up from her chair, started saying that it was absurd, that she was a victim, that it was all a conspiracy against her. The judge simply slammed her gavel down. "Ma'am, if you don't shut up now, we'll add contempt to the list." And so, screaming, she was taken out of the room by real officers. With her arrest, the HOA completely collapsed. The remaining members tried to continue with their ridiculous rules, but after I helped file a class-action lawsuit against the entire organization, the result was obvious. The HOA was disbanded completely. That's right, the condominium got rid of the HOA. For the first time in years, people could live in peace. And what about me? Well, I finally had my honeymoon. My wife and I traveled to the Caribbean and toasted our victory with piña coladas. And when we returned home, the condominium was different, happier. There were decorations on the balconies without fear of fines, children playing in the street without anyone saying, "It's not allowed." People were free. And all this because she tried to trap me in my own marriage. You know, at the end of the day, I should even thank this woman. Thanks to her, the entire community united against tyranny, and we got rid of the worst HOA in history, once and for all. And what about her? Well, she's exactly where she deserves to be. Behind bars, with no one to boss her around, no one to give her hell, and with no power, apart from choosing whether she wants a hot or cold prison meal for dinner.